for Polish Your Pitch. That is Michael Moraine. Michael manages the communications for the Iowa Department of Cultural Affairs, which I think you're all becoming familiar with, which oversees the State Historical Society, the Iowa Arts Council, and Produce Iowa. Michael joined the department in 2016 after a decade covering arts and culture for the Des Moines Register and previous reporting stints in Chicago, Washington, and New Delhi. The Ames native has taught journalism at Drake University and Iowa State University, holds degrees from Graceland University and Northwestern University, and is a two-time fellow of the National Endowment for the Arts Institute in Arts Journalism. He and his husband live in downtown Des Moines with their two cats, Eleanor Roosevelt and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Michael.
Thank you, Susan. The cats, I should tell you, the cats are sleeping right by me right now, so it's fully participatory. Here I go sharing my screen. And I think, can you see it okay, Susan?
You are good to go, Michael.
All right, thank you. So I want to talk just a little bit about how to talk to a broad audience. A lot of the projects you are doing and the organizations you represent have some great stories, and your immediate family, your mom, might be very proud of you. But I hope during this next half hour you can pick up a few tips to get more people to care about what your organizations are doing. Jennifer and Lindsay in the earlier portion of this session had some great specific ways to get specific audiences involved, boards or teachers, educators. But here I really want to focus on how to really help you expand your message to John Q. Public or Jane Q. Public, people who might be really fascinated in the material you have to offer, but may not know about it. So we'll just go through a few basic tips, and as always, if you have questions, type them in the chat box and we will cover them at the end. So we all know that the media landscape is changing month by month, year by year. The way the media works now is much different than it was 5 years ago, or especially 10 years ago. And there is so much competing for everybody's attention. We only have so many hours and minutes in the day, and every week it seems there's a new platform. We've certainly seen the rise of more of these platforms during the pandemic when people are spending more time at home. So there's a lot of competition out there, and people really can only take in so much information. So keep that in mind when you are trying to get more attention for your story or your organization. Keep in mind that people's attention spans are shrinking. Even though that is the reality of the media landscape in which we live in 2020, even as traditional media outlets are splintering and shrinking in a lot of ways, we all have increasing access to do-it-yourself marketing tools. So at the Department of Cultural Affairs, for example, instead of cranking out endless press releases to shrinking newsrooms that may not have the reporters to pick up our press releases or cover the stories themselves, we are more and more communicating directly with the audiences we want to reach through social media. So a lot of times it doesn't take a lot of know-how, it doesn't take a lot of expertise. Sometimes it just takes a little bit of experimentation. If you have a Facebook account, start taking photos of the things in your museum, or if you are working on a historic preservation project, offer people sort of a behind-the-scenes look at what you do. A lot of times for people who work in an organization, staffers or volunteers, after a while, you get used to some of the things. You see the same artifacts every day, or you see the same window restoration project every day over the course of weeks or months. And so that kind of becomes ordinary to you. But for outside audiences, there are things that are fascinating if they don't know about it. So keep that in mind. The things that for you have become sort of wallpaper might be fascinating to an outside audience. So I want to talk just a little bit about when you make a pitch to the media or a broader audience directly through social media, think about who it is you most want to reach. Sometimes we talk about low-hanging fruit. Who are the people that would be most interested in what you are doing that might not know about it right now. So if you run a museum, you have regular members and regular visitors, but there's also sort of a broader group of people who may not know they like history, right? And if they are considering how to spend a free weekend or how to spend a free evening, they might gravitate towards sports or the movies, or they might have a broad range of interests, but no one has dangled before them interesting history topics, especially local history topics. So think about who are the people who would be most interested in the stories you have to offer. And then once you sort of picture who that is, think about the best ways to reach that audience. Sometimes it does not require a lot of fancy, high-tech, expensive stuff. If you have an unlimited budget and can hire a plane to do some skywriting, go for it. But I have a hunch that most of you work at organizations that don't have an unlimited budget. So sometimes low-tech ways to communicate are just fine and often the most effective. This makes me think when we had an exhibit about the Iowa caucuses at the State Historical Museum, we had a display that showed the whole evolution of political signs, yard signs. And really, that's low technology, but it is effective, and it hasn't changed much over the last 100 years. But sometimes a yard sign about an upcoming exhibit that your museum might be offering might do the trick. So social media, obviously, I'll back up just a little there. For social media, there are proliferating platforms. Every day there's some new thing. But I think where we are right now in 2020, there are three main ones. Facebook is still the giant, has the biggest audience. Instagram is very popular and it's very image focused. And then Twitter also has a big following. And there are different advantages to each of those different platforms. But if you can only do one, if you can only really, if you only have the capacity to do one and the bandwidth for one, focus on Facebook. That is still, that's still the best, biggest platform for just photos and information and events. It lends itself very well to promoting upcoming events. So if you have to choose one, go with Facebook. Again, you can, if you have a lot of money or even a little bit of money, you can buy TV or radio ads or billboards, as I mentioned, skywriting. Those might be lavish if your budget is lavish, but think about different ways to reach the audience you want to reach. Also, enlist the media, especially newspapers. They are still active even in 2020. Iowa has one of the most active newspaper communities. The Iowa Newspaper Association likes to brag that Iowa still has between 250 and 300 active members in the Iowa Newspaper Association. So there's still a lot of newspapers that are publishing local news, and newspapers are uniquely equipped to cover some of the nitty-gritty details of what is going on in their communities. So I hope you know who your media folks are in your community, but if you don't, just poke around a little bit and see, familiarize yourself with the media outlets in your area and think about what are the stories that those media outlets often cover and how you could serve up your stories in a way that might get them to bite the bait. Again, magazines are also good. There's some good statewide magazines, Iowa History Journal, The Iowan, and some others are excellent media outlets in Iowa. And again, radio. Iowa has an active radio presence. There are lots of radio stations around the state. Just this past spring, Iowa Public Radio, Charity Nebby's Talk of Iowa program, every Thursday they have focused on Iowa history, which is great. And there's an audience for it. People tune into that. Again, TV. If you have a big event coming up, go ahead and pitch it to the local TV station. There's nothing to lose by pitching it, and you never know, it might pick up a new audience for you. So if you are taking notes, this is probably the most important slide in my chunk of this presentation. If you have taken any journalism course or Journalism 101, this diagram might look familiar to you. But this is really how news editors and reporters decide what is news, how to decide what is newsworthy. So any news story has different angles to it. But if there's some news story that can check a lot of the boxes around, or sort of check off a lot of the circles, the smaller circles around this diagram, the more circles it checks off, the more newsy it is. And this isn't something that I would say news editors and reporters don't talk about it often in these terms, but they after you work in news for a while, you sort of pick up some of these pick up some of this instinctively. So we'll just go around the clock there, starting at 1 o'clock. Prominence. If there are famous names involved, it is newsier than if there are not. Conflict, often, especially in Iowa, we're conflict averse. But sometimes if there is an element of conflict, that makes it newsier, and that is more interesting to read or to learn about. Proximity, if an event happens in your town, it is more newsworthy to that audience than if it happened in Kentucky or, I don't know, Peru. Timeliness, if it happened yesterday, it's more newsy than if it happened 3 months ago. Currency, if it's something that people are talking about, if it's something that's just sort of in the air, that also makes it newsier. If it's unusual, that often scores big points in terms of news value. If it happens every day and it's kind of run of the mill, who cares so much? But if it's unusual, that's good. If it has some element of the human spirit, some of the big ideas of the human experience, if it's about love or sacrifice, those often resonate with audiences in different ways. And then magnitude, up top there. If the news event or the news story affects a lot of people, it is newsier than if it affects just 3 people. So just, and you can sort of, as an exercise, you can apply these news values to any story you hear about. Obviously right now with the pandemic, or all of the national protests about social injustice, those are huge stories that check off all of the boxes. They really are newsy. One example of a news story that I like to trot out when I think about this diagram, a couple years ago, you may remember the story about the scandals with college admissions, where parents sort of cheated a little bit to get their kids into elite schools all across the country. So if you go around the circle there, you can see why that particular story lasted in the news cycle longer than a quick blip. It had some staying power and was in the news for several days, several weeks, because it checked off a lot of these boxes. Prominence, there were a few famous actors involved. Conflict, obviously there was conflict between, especially when there were lawsuits filed. Proximity, even if the universities involved weren't in your backyard, there are colleges and universities across the country. So smart reporters could sort of, they called up local university admissions offices and got their take on it. So there was some proximity there. Timeliness. I forget when the story broke, but I think it was in the spring when a lot of families with high schoolers were receiving acceptance or rejection letters. Currency, people were talking about it a lot, just a lot, and people talk about education, and that's a big part of community life. It was certainly unusual, or at least having that scandal exposed was unusual, but it did make people wonder, is this a common thing or is it rare? Certainly with the human spirit, there were questions about how far parents would go and how much parents would sacrifice in order to give their children a leg up. So that certainly asked them, the news story asked them big questions about that. And just the magnitude of the scandal, I think, resonated. So that's just one example, but really think about that when you are when you're approaching the media. This diagram might be helpful to help you think about something that might be very familiar to you, and you might be fascinated about one aspect of a historical story or an exhibit that you might be opening in your museum, but think about how you can emphasize some of these aspects in your pitch to the media. So I want to just offer one example. The State Historical Society oversees, or they sort of guide nominations to the National Register of Historic Places for Iowa. And often when new properties in Iowa are, or when historic properties are newly listed to the National Register, we write up a press release and send it to local media in the area of that property to see if we can get a little coverage for that new listing. So in some ways, this is a little tricky because with history, it is not timely at all. It is, history by definition is not news, but there are ways to package those stories in ways that are appealing to media outlets. So I wanted to take you through a press release we wrote up about the Yale Gymnasium. It's in Guthrie County. And it was a couple years ago, it was listed on the National Register. So we took the National Register nomination form, which was, those documents can be very dry at first glance with lots of historic details about the architecture and the shingles and the types of windows and its Queen Anne style or whatever, the technical elements of the architecture. That can be pretty dusty and not so interesting for a broad audience. But if you look a little closer, often in those historic register nomination forms, there are fascinating stories about previous generations who were solving problems in innovative ways or had interesting reasons for building their buildings. There are fascinating human interest stories in those forms. You just have to dig a little. So in this press release, we covered all of the things that we had to, just the who, what, where, when, why, the basics of a news story. But we pulled out some interesting details in a way that made this nomination listing a little more appealing to a broader audience. And we got a lot of play for it. The Des Moines Register picked up this story and just ran it verbatim, which was great. So I wanted to just sort of zip through this as an example. The first two paragraphs get straight to the point. You'll see in that second paragraph, it says, the Yale Gymnasium, with its distinctive round architectural design, is now listed on the National Register of Historic Places. In its heyday, it was home to the Yale Bulldogs boys and girls basketball teams and hosted band concerts, commencements, plays, and banquets, and even the Harlem Globetrotters until 1961. So with that highlight, you can already see that we wanted to emphasize the prominence. Most people have heard of the Harlem Globetrotters and might be, so in terms of prominence, we could score a few points there. But we also wanted to just add some sensory details with that sentence, that highlighted sentence there. You can almost smell the popcorn in the gym. You can almost hear the pet bands over the years. So we really wanted to make this history come alive. The article continues, and we talk here about who the architect was. He was an engineer. So we pull out some of the personal stories there. Then down lower, we pulled a direct quote from the nomination form. And here it gets a little bit into the technical details of the building itself. The building is in many ways designed like a very large silo. So even if you're not an architect, even if you don't care that much about architectural details or architectural history, that helps you picture who designed it and why it's round in the first place. Again, skimming through, we're just checking off the who, what, where, when, why. The city of Yale selected the gymnasium's unique design as a way to raise the town's status in regional sports and as a source of community pride. We also mentioned that the architect most likely pitched the design to give him an opportunity to stretch his engineering design skills. So again, we're just pulling some of the backstory behind this property. Again, more details about the stage and bleachers. and just the description, its corners were rounded off, and the walls were considered out of bounds. So again, if you don't care at all about architecture, but you've played basketball, you can see how playing basketball in that space might be a little different. So again, we are pulling in people who might not know they would be interested in a historic or in history or an article about history. Again, we go down a little bit more. Here we are noting how unusual this is. This gym was the first building of its kind in the state. And here we're just covering our bases because there are other contenders, other communities that might want to claim that title. Here's a quote from the nomination form. The court must have been a particular challenge for the Globetrotters' style of play and entertainment, but would certainly have enhanced the audience participation portion of their typical exhibitions. So again, this is a unique story to Yale, but it's unusual enough that that the editors of the Des Moines Register decided it had enough statewide appeal, and that this story might be interesting to people who have never been to Yale, who have never played in that gymnasium, but it has a sort of a bigger story, or more people can relate to it besides the people who live in the little town of Yale. All right, we'll move on. So once you identify what is compelling about your story or what you would like to pitch to the media, go ahead and simplify your pitch as much as you can. Really, when I was at the Register, I worked there about a dozen years, and I received lots and lots of press releases. Every day I sifted through dozens to decide what I wanted to write about. And some of them were great press releases and they were irresistible, and some of them were totally boring. And often my inbox was just a big pit of guilt because I couldn't cover everything, and I had to make some hard decisions about who I was gonna focus the spotlight on and who I was gonna ignore. But it was sort of a fire hose of press releases. So when you are pitching yours, make sure that you get straight to the point and make sure it's very clear what the story is. So you want to make it as easy as possible for the reporter to pick up your story instead of all the others that are competing for his or her attention. So often I received, I was the arts reporter, so I received press releases about exhibitions or from artists, and often artists, they worked, sometimes they included artist statements, which were beautiful, and I could tell that they had been very carefully written, but they were very abstract about their artistic philosophy. And as a news reporter, that was less useful to me than just the basic who, what, where, when, how much does the event cost, and where can I learn more? What's the best website to learn more information? So get right to the point if you are sending out a press release or contacting media in your area. This is really key. Have good photos. Again, you want to make it as easy as possible for reporters to take your story and plop it into the news. So if you are a good photographer yourself, great. If not, find someone who can take some good photos. Fortunately, with evolving technology, you don't need a big fancy computer or a big fancy camera. Just your basic iPhone takes really good photos, but make sure you have some good photos and make sure they are high resolution. So whatever it is, if it's artifacts or if it's part of historic property, just make sure you have photos that are relevant to your story. It helps to have people in the photo. That just makes it more broadly appealing for news outlets and the general public. Sometimes it helps to have color photos and black and white, depending on the outlet you are pitching to. And this is really key. Make sure that the photos you send to the media, especially print media, have a resolution that's high enough that the publisher can lay it into the printed layout and it will be clear. I'm not a tech expert at all, but I know just enough about the language of it. If a reporter or editor asks you for 300 DPI, that's dots per inch, and sometimes that's hard to measure, but in if you click on the properties of a photo file, and if it takes up at least 1 megabyte of data, then it's usually pretty good. If it's under that, then it limits how big the layout designer or the editor can run it in the story. So if you can get a photo about at least 1 megabyte, you'll be good to go. Also, make sure that if you send a photo, make sure it's clear what is in the photo. So in the email, identify the people in the photo. Usually if there are fewer than 5 people, go ahead and include their names. If it's a big group, you don't have to mess with it. But again, just make it easy for the reporter to tuck those photos into a story and make their job easier. Also, attach a photo credit if you want to get credit for it, or if you got the photo from somebody else, make sure that he or she gets credit. Again, when you are emailing to media, it helps if you attach photos to the email rather than pasting them into the text of the email. Or if you have a website and there's some way to make your photos just easy to download from the website, that's golden. When I was at the Register, I wrote a lot of reviews about the Des Moines Playhouse. And they were a big enough organization that they had a media person, but they had a corner of their website specifically for media, and I knew that I could go there and download whatever photos I needed without any hassles. So sometimes when push came to shove, if I was putting together 5 best bets for the coming week and I was on deadline, sometimes I would favor the Des Moines Playhouse because I knew they would have a good photo. And if I was bumping up against a deadline and I needed something quick, sometimes the Des Moines Playhouse made that list only because they were easier and they were more convenient. So give yourself all of the advantages you can, and whatever you can do to make a reporter's job easier, that increases your chances of getting coverage. Also, consider the format. There are lots of different ways to reach audiences, and people consume news in lots of different ways, especially now. Our patterns are very splintered. But think about where people get the information and where you want something to land. So some organizations have calendar listings, some media organizations have calendar listings, or maybe your local chamber has a good online calendar. Think about preview blurbs. If you have an upcoming event, where would be the best spot to put a preview, write up a preview blurb? A lot of times art exhibits or artists or performing arts folks they pitched and they really wanted a review, but sometimes it was in their own best interest to not have a review. And if they really wanted to put butts in seats, sometimes it's more important to have news ahead of time rather than an evaluation afterward. So think about what kind of format is most useful to serve your goals. Sometimes it helps to have profiles of key players. If you are renovating a historic building, it might be interesting to just highlight or pitch mini bios or mini stories about everybody who contributed, whether that's the architect or the fundraiser or maybe the family that's going to move into a historic house. Think about who are the characters in that story, and maybe that's how you want to pitch your news story. Also, again, you are an expert in your organization or your project or your museum. Think about what are the most interesting things that you know that John or Jane Q Public don't know because they're not on the inside. So anytime you can pull back the curtain and let people see sort of backstage or see behind the curtain, all the better. Think about timing too. I'll just go down here. There's no magic rule on when is the best time to approach media with a story pitch. Here's just sort of a general outline, but you don't have to stick to this. This isn't set in stone. But think about the more the better it is just to help them plan their stories for the next couple days or next couple of weeks or next couple of months. And really, do not worry about pestering a reporter. Sometimes people would call me or email me at the Register and they would sort of be hesitant. As long as people were, as long as you don't demand anything, I think reporters appreciate reminders because they are sifting through lots of pitches, they're juggling a lot of things. So it's okay to speak up when you have something coming up that you want coverage for. All right, this is important. Sometimes museums, they might have great stuff, but if that stuff is always there and you can always see it, there's no good reason for people to visit it at a certain time, and there might not be a great reason for reporters to cover it at a certain time. So go ahead and host an open house or a workshop or a demonstration or offer a backstage tour or a gallery talk, something so that it lands on the calendar. So that gives reporters a reason to cover it at a certain time. Media agencies or outlets are very deadline driven. So unless it lands on a calendar with a specific deadline, it's always going to get on the back burner. All right. I see we're running close on our time here. But if you do create an event or you have a story, think about what else is going on. A lot of times news outlets will cover a holiday, the 4th of July, and it's a challenge to cover the 4th of July in a new way every year. But editors and reporters will be looking for a story to serve up on the 4th of July or before the 4th of July. So here's some different examples of different ways that you can just think about pitching your story at a time when it's most likely to get some media coverage. The Des Moines Art Center one time hosted a drawing class in the Papa John's Sculpture Park downtown, and they tagged it to Earth Day because they knew reporters might be looking for an Earth Day story. So here's one on a silver platter. It's very visual. When a local playwright here in Des Moines premiered a musical called about the Iowa caucuses, he didn't do it in the middle of the summer. He did it in January, right before the Iowa caucuses, when lots of media were here in town. So think about that. And then just most important, even if you get swatted away by the media and they don't cover your event or your project, just keep trying and keep trying and keep trying and just keep trying. Because what you do, if it interests you, if the stories of your museum or your organization interest you, it's likely other people will be interested too. You just have to figure out a way to let them know about it and broaden your story to a wide audience of people who might really want to know about it. They just don't know yet, including reporters. So I zipped through things there, but really, if you have any questions, if you are trying to figure out how to get attention for your project, feel free to email me. I can sort of help you practice your pitch a little bit or sharpen up your press release to get some media attention. So Susan may have some questions. I'm all ears.
Well, one is a curiosity question, Michael. You gave the example of the round gymnasium. And so the question is about, you talked a lot about the outside, but the hook was more the inside of what happened. So in that press release and story, did you also focus on the interior and show the interior, or talk a little bit about how you chose what to focus on?
Yes, let me see if I have this. Oh, I don't. Okay, that's all right. We did include interior photos. So we wanted to make sure that some of the details that we described in the text, we had some photos from that. So again, it always helps to have more photos with your story. So that's a good question.